Chapter 6. The people that lived in hiding. Now began the happiest times that Caspian had ever known. On a fine summer morning, when the dew lay on the grass, he set off with the badger and the two dwarfs up through the forest into the high saddle of the mountains and down onto the sunny southern slopes, where one looked across the green worlds of Archenland. We will first go to the 3 bulgy bears, said Trumpkin. They came in a glade to a hollow oak tree covered with moss, and Truffle Hunter tapped with his paw 3 times on the trunk, and there was no answer. He then tapped again. A woolly sort of voice from inside said, "Go away, it's not time to get up yet." But when he tapped a 3rd time, there was a little noise like a small earthquake from inside, and a sort of door opened, and out came 3 brown bears, very bulgy indeed, and blinking their little eyes. And everything had been explained to them, which took a long time because they were so sleepy. They said, just as Truffle Hunter had said, that a son of Adam ought to be king of Narnia, and all kissed Caspian very wet, snuffly kisses, and offered him some honey. Caspian didn't really want honey without bread at that time in the morning, but he thought to be polite, he would accept. It took him a long time afterwards to get unsticky. After all that, they went on until they came among the beech trees, and Truffle Hunter called out, "Patterwig, Patterwig, Patterwig!" And almost at once, bounding down from a branch until it was just above their heads, came the most magnificent red squirrel that Caspian had ever seen. He was far bigger than the ordinary dumb squirrels, which he had known sometimes and seen around the castle gardens. Instead, he was nearly the size of a terrier, and the moment you looked into his face, you could tell he could talk. Indeed, the difficulty was to get him to stop talking, for like all squirrels, he was a chatterer. He welcomed Caspian at once and asked if he would like a nut, and Caspian said thanks, he would. But Patterwig went bounding away to fetch it. As Patterwig went bounding away to fetch it, Truffle Hunter whispered in Caspian's ear, "Don't look the other way. It's very bad manners among squirrels to watch where anyone is going so that he has his store, or to look as if you wanted to know where it was." So here's the pictures of the bears and the pictures of the squirrel. So I heard a story this week that was really interesting. There was a bear that came down from probably the Buttes and was climbed up in a tree at this family's house, really tall in an evergreen tree, way, way up. And they were afraid it might hurt somebody, so they put it to sleep so they could take it somewhere else. But that bear was about halfway between where Devin and Margot and Savvy and Tristan and Wesley and Camden live, and Grandma's church. Almost halfway in between on Adams. Can you imagine having a bear in your yard? One that didn't talk. Kind of scary, huh? Then Patterwig came back with the nut, and Caspian ate it, and after that, Patterwig asked if he could take any message to other friends, "For I can go nearly everywhere without setting foot to ground," he said. Truffle Hunter and the dwarves thought this was a very good idea and gave Patterwig messages to all sorts of people with queer names, telling them all to come and to a feast and council on the dancing lawn at midnight 3 nights ahead. "And you better tell them 3 bulgies too," added Trumpkin. "We forgot to mention it to them." It was their next visit. They went to the 7 brothers of Shuddering Wood. Trumpkin led the way back to the saddle, and then down eastward and on the northern slope of the mountains until they came to a very solemn place among rocks and fir trees. They went very quietly And presently Caspian could feel the ground shake under his feet, as if someone were hammering down below. Trumpkin went to a flat stone about the size of the top of a water butt, and stamped on it with his foot. After a long pause, it was moved away by someone or something underneath. And there was a dark, round hole with a good deal of heat and steam coming out of it in the middle of the whole of the head of a dwarf, very like Trumpkin himself. There was a long talk here, and the dwarf seemed more suspicious than the squirrel or the bugly bears had been. But in the end, the whole party were invited to come down. Caspian found himself descending in a dark stairway into the earth, but when he came to the bottom, he saw firelight, and it was the light of a furnace. The whole place was a smithy. The subterranean steam ran past on one side of it. The two dwarfs were at the bellows. Another was holding a piece of red hot metal and an anvil with pairs of tongs. A fourth was hammering it, and two were wiping their horny little hands on the greasy cloth that coming forward to meet the new visitors. It took some time to satisfy them that Caspian was a friend and not an enemy, but when they did, they all cried, "Long live the king!" And their gifts were noble. Mail shirts and helmets and swords for Caspian and Trumpkin and Knickerbock. The badger could have had the same if he had liked, but he said he was a beast. He was, and if his claws and teeth could not keep his skin whole, he wasn't worth keeping. The workmanship of the arms was finer than any Caspian had ever seen, and he gladly accepted the dwarf-made sword instead of his own, which looked, in comparison, as feeble as a toy and as clumsy as a stick. The 7 brothers, who were all red dwarfs, promised to come to the feast of the dancing lawn. A little farther on, in a dry, rocky ravine, they reached the cave of the black dwarfs. They looked suspiciously at Caspian, but in the end, the eldest of them said, "If he is against Murat, we'll have him for a king." The next oldest said, "Shall we go further up for you, up to their crags? There's an ogre or two and a hag that we could introduce you to up there." "Certainly not," said Caspian. "I should think not indeed," said Truffle Hunter. "We want none of that sort on our side." Knickerbock disagreed with this, but Trumpkin and the badger overruled him. It gave Caspian a shock to realize that these horrible creatures out of the old stories, as well as the nice ones, had been some descendants of Narnia still. We should not have Aslan for friend if we brought in that rabble," said Truffle Hunter, as they came away from the cave of the black dwarves. "Oh, Aslan," said Trumpkin cheerily, but contemptuously. "What matters much more than you wouldn't have me." "Do you believe in Aslan?" said Caspian to Knickerbock. "I'll believe in anyone or anything," said Knickerbock, "that'll batter those crushed Telmarine barbarians to pieces or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything, Aslan or the White Witch. Do you understand?" "Silence, silence," said Truffle Hunter. "You do not know what you are saying. She is a worse enemy than Muraz and all his race." "Not to dwarfs she wasn't," said Knickerbock. Their next visit was a pleasanter one. As they came lower down, the mountains opened onto a great glen of wooded gorge, with a swift river running at the bottom. The open places near the river's edge were a mass of foxgloves and wild roses, and the air was burning with bees. Here Truffle Hunter called again, "Glenstorm, Glenstorm!" And after a pause, Caspian heard the sound of hooves. It grew louder until the valley trembled, and at last, breaking and trampling at the thickets, there came the sight of the noblest creature that Caspian had yet seen. The great centaur Glenstorm and his 3 sons. His flanks were glossy chestnut, and his beard that covered his broad chest was golden red. He was a prophet and a stargazer, and they knew that they had come, and he knew what they had come about. "Long live the king," he cried, "and I and my sons are ready for war. When is the battle to be joined?" Up till now, neither Caspian nor the others had really been thinking of a war. They had some vague idea, perhaps, of an occasional raid on some human farmstead or attacking a party of hunters if it ventured too far into those southern wilds. But in the main, they had only thought of living to themselves in woods and caves and building up an attempt at old Narnia and hiding. As soon as Glenstrom had spoken, everyone felt much more serious. "Do you mean a real war to drive Miraz out of Narnia?" asked Caspian. "What else?" said the centaur. "Why else does your majesty so clad in mail and girt with swords?" It is possible, Glenstrom?" said the badger. "The time is ripe," said Glenstrom. "I watch the skies, badger, for it is mine to watch, and it is yours to remember. Tarva and Alambil have met in the halls of high heaven, and on earth a son of Adam has once more arisen to rule and name the creatures. The hour has struck. Our council at the dancing lawn must be a council of war." He spoke in such a voice that neither Caspian nor the others hesitated for a moment. It now seemed to them quite possible that they might win a war, and quite certain that they must wage one. It was now past the middle of the day. They rested with the centaurs, and ate such food as the centaurs provided: cakes of oaten meal, apples and herbs, and wine and cheese. The next day, the next place they were to visit was quite near at hand, but they had to go a long way around in order to avoid the region by which men lived. It was well into the afternoon before they found themselves on level fields warm between hedgerows. There, Truffle Hunter called the mouth of the little hole in the green bank, and out popped the last thing Caspian had expected: a talking mouse. He was, of course, bigger than the common mouse, well over a foot high when he stood on his hind legs, with his ears nearly as long, though broader than a rabbit's. His name was Reepicheep. He was a gay and marital mouse. He was a tiny little rapier he wore a tiny little rapier at his side and twirled his long whiskers as if they were a mustache. "There are 12 of us, sire," he said with a dashing and graceful bow, "and I place all of my resources of my people unreservedly at your majesty's disposal." And here is the mouse. Reepicheep. Caspian tried hard and successfully not to laugh, but he couldn't help thinking that Reepicheep and all his people could very easily be put in a washing basket and carried home on one's back. It would take too long to mention all the creatures whom Caspian met that day: Clodsley Shroud, the mole, and 3 hard biters who were badgers like Truffle Hunter, and Calamiro the hare, and Hugglestock the hedgehog. And they rested at the last beside a well at the edge of a wide and level circle of grass bordered with tall elms, which now threw long shadows across it, for the sun was setting. The daisies closing, the rooks flying home to bed. Here they supped on food they had brought with them, and Trumplekin lit his pipe. Knickerbrick was not a smoker. "Now," said the badger, "if only we could wake the spirits of these trees as well, we should have done a good day's work." "Can't we?" said Caspian. "No," said Truffle Hunter, "we have no power over them. Since the humans came into the land, falling forests and defiling streams, the dryads and naiads have sunk into the deep sleep. Who knows if they will ever stir again? And that is a great loss to our side. The Telmarines are horribly afraid of the woods. And once the trees moved in anger, our enemies would go mad with fright and be chased out of Narnia as quick as their legs could carry them. What imaginations you animals have, said Trumpkin, who didn't believe in such things. But why stop with trees and waters? Wouldn't it be even nicer if the stones started throwing themselves at old Miraz? The badger only grunted at this. And after that, there was such silence that Caspian had nearly dropped off to sleep when he thought he heard a faint musical sound in the depth of the woods at his back. Then he thought it was only a dream and turned over again. But as soon as his ear touched the ground, he felt or heard, it was hard to tell which, a faint beating of drumming. He raised his head. The beating noise at once became fainter, but the music returned clearer all the time. It was like maybe flutes. He turned and saw Truffle Hunter was sitting up and staring into the wood. The moon was bright. Caspian had been asleep longer than he thought. Nearer and nearer came the music, the tune, wild and yet dreamy. Sorry, there you go. And the noise of many light feet, till at last out from the wood into the moonlight came dancing shapes such as Caspian had been thinking of all of his life. They were not much taller than dwarfs, but far slighter and more graceful. Their curly heads had little horns, and upper parts of their bodies gleamed naked in the pale light, but their legs and feet were those of goats. Fawns, said Caspian, jumping up, and in a moment they were all around him. It took next to no time to explain the whole situation to them, and they accepted Caspian at once. Before he knew what he was doing, he found himself joining in the dance. Trumpkin, with heavier and jerkier movements, did likewise, and even Truffle Hunter hopped and lumbered about as best he could. Only Nickabrick stayed where he was, looking on in silence. The fawns footed it all around Caspian, and their reedy pipes, their strange faces, which seemed mournful and merry all at once, looked into his. Dozens of fawns, mentors, obstinces, damnus, volums, volturians, Girbus, Nimians, Nausus, and Ascuna. Paterwick had sent them all. When Caspian awoke the next morning, he could hardly believe it had not been all a dream, but the grass was covered with little cloven hoof marks. And that's the end of chapter 6.